In today's interview, we explore the trends and investments that push and support companies to accelerate their transition to a safer chemicals economy. As we navigate the complexities of modern economies, the concept of 50 Shades of Green emerges, highlighting the diverse and multifaceted approaches and claims to sustainability and investment. Together with our two investor illustrators, Alexandra McPherson of the Investor Environmental Health Network for Clean Production Action and Caroline Boden from Mercy Investment Services, Inc., I try to discover those shades of green that can contribute to a more sustainable future. Ali and Caroline, what does sustainable growth mean to you? And why is it important for businesses and society today?
Great. Well, super excited to be here to have this conversation. Sustainable growth really means the acceleration of solutions that address the systemic risks we're facing today. And I really look at those in two buckets. One is the social inequity and one is environmental degradation. If you look at the World Economic Report, their risk report that came out in early 2025, 50% of the risks they're looking at 10 years ahead are environmentally related. So for me, it's about advancing and scaling solutions across all market sectors that are more inherently benign, safe, and sustainable for society, both for products and production.
And Caroline?
Yeah, from our perspective, so maybe first, Mercy Investment Services, we are the socially responsible asset manager for the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas, a group of Catholic women religious. So we very much approach both our investment strategies and our active engagement with portfolio companies through a faith-based lens, so bringing together both a moral perspective and also a financial perspective. So for us, sustainable growth is really a way, I think to Ali's point, to address some of those systemic risks that we see within our economy, our society, to help advance sustainable solutions that are better for people and planet. And for us, we don't see the advancement of sustainable solutions and addressing the systemic risks to people and planet as mutually exclusive to financial benefits and return on investment for companies and their shareholders.
Okay, the grass is always green on the other side of the fence. What are the main challenges companies face when transitioning to sustainable growth practices, and is money one of them?
I can kick that off. So I think from our experience in engaging companies on safer chemicals management and transitioning to sustainable solutions, I think one of the key challenges that we've encountered, and this is maybe specifically to the public equity sector, is identifying companies that are willing to be leaders. In some cases, we've experienced that companies are perhaps nervous about setting a leadership example and being ahead of the rest of the marketplace, and so taking the risks associated with that. Where we come in as shareholders in public equity companies is to, I think, help address and identify those material risks and assure them that we as investors in those companies are supportive as they make those transitions. I think certainly in some cases, depending on where the company is within the value chain, that money could be more of a challenge. Certainly when we think about like venture capital and startups, that's more of a necessity for them to begin their journey of investing in and advancing sustainable solutions.
Okay, Ali, you want to add to that?
Yes, I mean, I agree with everything Caroline just said, and I think we have to look at the reallocation of capital. This is a significant shift from the current materials economy that was deeply subsidized. The fossil fuel materials economy was subsidized for our energy system. It was subsidized during World War II. So they have innate financial leverage and benefits that make it very hard for new companies to compete. So our perspective is that large companies that have the ability to shift markets and create trends and create tipping points in their sector have the opportunity to help invest in those new companies, or even help some of the bigger chemical companies start to transition their R&D focus to sustainable and safer materials by ensuring that those materials are going to be bought. And that's going to really help address a sustainable reallocation of capital. And I think governments have a huge role to play in taking away subsidies where we know environmental economic harm is happening.
Okay. Caroline, what are the financial benefits of investing in sustainable growth for both companies and investors?
That's a great question. So again, from our perspective as a faith-based asset manager, we're really looking at some of those systemic risks. And so again, risks to both companies and their investors, but also risks to people and planet. So for us, we see the financial benefit in advancing sustainable solutions, transitioning to safer chemicals. What that does is it helps to future-proof companies and de-risk, whether it's risks associated with forthcoming or existing legislation, potential litigation, consumer demand. We're certainly seeing from the consumer side this increased demand for safe and clean products. And so from our perspective, companies that are proactive in their chemical management journey and are investing in these solutions, they're helping to de-risk for the long term and again help to address some of these systemic risks that are facing our whole economy and our whole society. So for us, it's a win-win in terms of our investment approach.
And I'm just going to build on that future-proofing piece, as I think everything Caroline said links to the megatrends that we're facing in society. And there's the positive trend that we have younger generations of consumers, particularly in Europe and the United States, that really prefer safer and more sustainable products. And they only want to work for companies, right, that have a value-based perspective on these issues, because they are inherently highly impacted by climate change, chemical pollution, the systemic risks. So I think they're future-proofing themselves. They're also really adding value to their reputation. If you look at that on the opposite side, they're reducing reputational risk. We see huge reputational risk with companies that sell products with toxic chemicals embedded in them, and you find out it's a toxic toy or toxic cosmetic product, and then there's liability, and then consumers are concerned. That's very hard for companies to reel that back in, and that's so important for them. So I think this really helps them, maintain their brand and future-proof themselves for all the other reasons Caroline mentioned.
Caroline, what are the key factors investors consider when evaluating sustainable growth opportunities? When do you give the green light? Or in other words, how can companies attract and retain investors who prioritize sustainability?
It's a good question, and I do want to clarify perhaps that, so for Mercy Investment Services, we don't do much in the space of venture capital, but we do have our Environmental Solutions Fund, and so it's a portion of our portfolio where it's really focused on market rate investments in green and sustainable solutions, so things like clean tech, clean water access, sustainable agricultural solutions. And so from that perspective, we do very careful evaluation of those investment opportunities and the potential impact that they can have, obviously, for people and planet. The work that I do on shareholder advocacy work and engaging directly with portfolio companies, we're already invested in them, but we're really looking to see what is the progression of growth for those companies. Are they on their chemicals management journey? So factors that we might look at is, do they have a safer chemicals policy? Have they established a restricted substances list, for instance? Have they done that evaluation of their own portfolios to understand where there's that exposure and risk associated with chemicals of concern? And are they taking measures to reduce and eliminate that risk exposure, and are they being transparent about it? So sort of flipping the question a little bit, but from an engagement perspective, we're looking for that progression and that constant growth to understand how the companies in our portfolio are helping to address these risks.
Okay. Ellie, what role do environmental, social and governance, the ESG criteria, play in investment decisions, and how can businesses measure the proof of impact of their sustainable growth initiatives?
So ESG, I just think, provides an additional screen for companies. It helps them look through another lens and have another data set that both helps them reduce risk as well as determine, are they really adding value? If they have a sustainable fund, like Caroline just mentioned, that has set criteria, maybe it's on carbon, it's on safer chemicals, it's on resource reduction or circular economy, they have to have clear metrics. Funds are creating clear metrics for those, particularly venture capital funds that are putting new money into startups. So transparency on impact metrics, I think, is really important, so that companies really demonstrate that they are doing something inherently different than their competitors, so differentiating themselves in the marketplace. They are really, not the status quo, that they have customers that want this, need this, big customers lining up. I think those are really key aspects. But ESG is a screen, so it's data and analysis that I think all investors want, because that analysis will help investors look at where potential risks are in their portfolio. So PFAS would be a perfect example. If you're doing a screen looking through an environmental and social lens, you're going to get early warning signs that PFAS is causing water contamination in major economies across the world, and that's creating concerns, and therefore companies are going to get pressure. They're going to get potential fines, they're going to get a loss of a permit, they're going to get a market restriction through state or EU legislation. That's what ESG allows companies or investors to do, to sort of almost future-proof their portfolios through a screen and a lens and data and analysis that doesn't always come through traditional data sets.
I see you nodding, so that's what you do as well?
Yeah, very much in agreement. I think where environmental, social, and governance criteria have helped us is to move beyond perhaps traditional materiality assessments that companies will do. And so that's really understanding the risks that are material to their respective business. What we, and again, I think particularly as a faith-based investment organization, we also want to think about salient risks, or taking a double materiality approach. And so utilizing environmental, social, and governance criteria helps us also understand not just the risks that are material to the businesses, the companies that we hold in our portfolio, but what are the salient risks and impacts that their operations, products, services are having on people and planet, and how that can create sort of broader pressures and risks to the economy and the growth of our portfolio.
Okay. Hey, we talk about companies. How can businesses ensure that their supply chains are aligned with their sustainability goals?
I think there's a couple sort of very formal, practical things that companies can do with their supply chain partners. We've seen implementation of criteria, whether it's on environmental, social issues, through things like supplier code of conduct, directly through supplier contracts. So that's sort of a more formal way of mandating practices and implementation of certain criteria. We've seen a lot of success where companies focus on educating and really engaging directly with their supply chain. So helping suppliers understand associated risks with chemicals of concern, or maybe it's human rights risks within their supply chain, and how they can then build out their own due diligence systems and processes to help mitigate those risks, which then filters throughout the whole supply chain.
What is your supply chain view?
My supply chain view really comes from the orientation of the organization I work for. So the Investor Environmental Health Network is a part of Clean Production Action, and we've really tried to create tools and resources that help companies work with their supply chains to screen chemicals. So the Green Screen for Safer Chemicals, for example, is a hazard-based benchmarking tool that ranks chemicals from 1, 2, 3, and 4, 4 being the best, 1 being this chemical is on an authoritative list, it's going to create a risk for you in your supply chain or in your product. And so, a company like Apple will work with their suppliers, and they'll use Green Screen to specify safer solvents, and they'll say to their suppliers, you need to actually be producing solvents that are going to be benchmark 2 and higher, for example. So it's a tool that is creating clear criteria. And the Chemical Footprinting Project, too, is also a tool that major retailers and brands are using to communicate the type of change they want to see when we're talking about this transition to safer chemicals, and or even holding companies accountable to meeting the restricted substance list that the company sets, or the criteria for safer chemicals. So I think there's a lot of tools and resources out there now for companies that independently verify it, so that they know their supply chain is moving towards clear criteria and moving them away from a risk and into a value.
Okay. Is it difficult for companies to balance profitability with sustainability in their growth strategies? To make some companies green with envy, can you provide some examples of companies that have successfully integrated sustainability in their growth models?
There's, I think, a lot of great examples. And again, I think that sustainability and profitability are not mutually exclusive. And so We've seen, I think, great progress within, especially the retail and the consumer goods sector. I think Walmart is a tremendous example where what they've done is they've embedded commitments around sustainability into their business strategy, whether it's through things like their Project Gigaton, which focuses on carbon emissions, or through their commitment to reduce the chemical footprint of their formulated products. And I think that was a 2022 goal of 10%. They exceeded it. They reached a 17% chemical footprint reduction in their formulated products. They're moving beyond that. They're continuing to do that great work. We see from other companies also in the retail consumer goods sector, Reckitt, Procter & Gamble, Lowe's, Target, just to name a few, who, again, I think what has led to their success of bringing sustainability in and marrying it with profitability is really embedding those commitments into their business strategy and having buy-in both from top to bottom, so from the CEO all the way down, and I would say also bottom up, and having it be a company-wide effort to bake in sustainability commitments and programs into the business strategy, and then profitability comes with that. And I think, again, we're really looking at the long term. And so it's getting companies maybe also to shift from, especially in the public equity space, of the focus on quarterly earnings calls and the pressure that can come with that, to really thinking about those long-term growth opportunities that might come from consumer demand and regulatory pressures and such.
Okay, Ellie, you also have some examples that can make companies green with envy?
Well, I think Caroline just provided, really good examples. And there's many more, but I want to sort of go to the opposite side of what happens when you don't. And so if you don't embed those values, integrate them into your sort of value chain and your corporation holistically, what happens? I mean, I think we've seen sort of the situation with Johnson & Johnson and the asbestos contaminated talc. I mean, the company went into bankruptcy. We've seen this with other companies as well. I mean, 3M lost enormous amount of their value as a company because they didn't embed sustainability and sustainable growth into their plan so that they could do a longer transition and really plan for the transition away from PFAS. They both companies, 3M and J&J, justified the use of these materials for as long as they could until courts and regulations intervened, and then it's much more expensive for companies. So because Caroline provided such a positive lens on why sustainable growth, I'm trying to just also provide the flip side of that coin, because we always talk about sustainable growth as a cost versus no, is it actually what is going to allow you to grow in the future? If you don't embed this in, are you going to lose market share and lose your competitive posture in your sector?
Okay. Hey, there is a lot of buzz around authority-inspired investments. In the European Union, the Draghi report emphasizes the urgent need for sustainability and innovation to boost Europe's competitiveness, highlighting that an additional yearly investment of 800 billion euros is required to address key challenges such as energy transition, clean industrial competitiveness. How do regulatory frameworks influence investment in sustainable growth?
They have huge impact on investment in sustainable growth, and I think the EU has been leading the way for quite some time. I would say here in the United States, because we're here in Boston, we have incredible state-based programs that both create chemical restrictions on products and production, but they also have these R&D programs. So California has a massive green chemistry program. It's one of the largest economies in the world. New York is doing green procurement, really trying to do everything they can, both on energy and chemicals and materials, to transition to safer, more sustainable. How do they provide tax advantages? How do they restrict chemicals of concern? So they're doing the carrot and the stick. Federally, I think the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, did an enormous amount of impact on really helping grow our renewable energy economy. We have new factories for solar and batteries, and I know Caroline knows this because we've been engaging companies like First Solar who are positively creating jobs and growing our sort of renewable energy economy here. That was a huge stimulus. We have a Safer and Sustainable Chemistry Act that is also positioned to help grow R&D. And then I think Europe has so many tools we just heard about this morning, and they are going to have a multiplier effect. And hopefully all that can be organized under the new UN Global Framework on Chemicals that is calling for 2030 transitions and financing that transition through public-private partnerships. And I think a lot of opportunities to bring these various parties together under that framework will hopefully drive more capital towards solutions.
Towards solutions. Caroline, what is your view on authority-inspired investments?
I think very similar to what Ali highlighted. We look to those regulations both in terms of the carrot and the stick approach. So as Ali had mentioned, we see within the US context that so many states are really taking the lead on chemical restriction legislation, whether it's on PFAS or other chemicals of concern. That's a pressure point that when we go to our portfolio companies, we can point to that to understand how they're managing the associated risks with that. And again, I think to sort of earlier comments of how are they future-proofing and being proactive in their transition so that they're prepared for this shift in the regulatory space. Certainly as well, the opportunity through public procurement and public funding, whether it's through the Inflation Reduction Act or similar forms of legislation to help support companies in their transition. I think we very much acknowledge that accomplishing everything that we have set out in front of us through the Sustainable Development Goals and a transition to safe and sustainable chemistry is going to require all hands on deck, a multitude of stakeholders, and certainly a lot of investment. And so, from our perspective, we're keeping our eyes open also for those new opportunities, whether it's through our Environmental Solutions Fund or other investment opportunities where we can also help support the leaders in the space.
You already mentioned the word future-proofing. Currently, with all the geopolitical turmoil, we see a lowering of the sustainability bar. Have you already discovered some green shoots that signal a new sustainability spring is coming?
There are some super exciting innovations that are new companies that are trying to detoxify and defossilize. So they're trying to create new materials that can be ubiquitously used in products and productions, new solvents, biosolvents. So there's companies like Genomatics, which is now supported by Unilever, L'Oreal. There's companies like Iconics, which is supported by Colgate-Palmolive. So these are startup companies creating the next generation of greener, safer chemistries, and they already have proof of concept that their materials are going into mainstream products. Like that to me is so exciting, and I think really our future is in growing those types of companies to be at scale.
Talking about growing, money doesn't grow on trees, so companies need investors. There are two initiatives, the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative and the Net Zero Banking Alliance, that are initiated to play a crucial role to mobilize the financial sector to address climate change and to promote sustainable investment practices. Influenced by the threat of lawsuits, members like BlackRock are withdrawing from these initiatives, and they are now less inclined to include sustainability considerations in their activities. I know the common expression is don't air your dirty laundry in public, but can you indicate some implications from these shifts away from sustainability?
I'm happy to start with that one. And I think first and foremost, I do want to establish that each individual investment organization or individual is responsible for making their investment decisions, particularly if they have a fiduciary responsibility to fulfill, as in the case of BlackRock, for instance. That being said, I think the rollback and the step back that we're seeing from a multitude of stakeholders, including large institutional investors, on sustainability issues is definitely concerning. From our perspective at Mercy Investment Services, we see things like climate change, biodiversity and nature loss, the health impacts from pollution. These are material risks. And if we do not address these material risks, if we don't have a planet, we don't have an economy. If we don't address the impacts to biodiversity and nature, that impacts our economic success, the growth of our portfolio, the growth of businesses. So I think I would call on sort of the investment in the finance community and other stakeholders as well is to really think about those material risks. And certainly for us at Mercy as an investment organization, we think about materiality a lot and how that can impact return on investment, how that can impact growth of companies. But if we're not addressing these very systemic and real issues, then none of that's going to matter. And so to me, it is concerning that we see, I would almost say, not just a step back from sustainability, but really a step back from materiality assessments, which is perhaps of a broader concern.
Ellie?
Well, I obviously agree with all that. I mean, the materiality doesn't change. And I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the World Economic Report, in sort of their 2-year sort of risk timeline, extreme weather is number 2, below misinformation. And if you look at 10 years, extreme weather might be 1, but the top 5 are all environmental risk, and then 10 is pollution. So it's a real disadvantage for these firms and their customers, their clients, the economy at large, because now they're pulling themselves out of these alliances that provide essential data and analysis and research. And so it doesn't make strategic sense because it's such a material issue that has not changed. The weight of the evidence hasn't changed. And you're looking at massive changes in the financial system. In some cases, we see premiums in insurance going up 100% in the southeast part of the United States, in the Gulf area, Texas, Louisiana, because of the massive hurricanes coming through and hitting production facilities. So I don't understand at this juncture how anyone would view the materiality different, because the weight of evidence is only growing, that the financial implications are getting more extreme. So I hope that those changes and trends we see are reversed quickly, and I too would call on all financial firms to bring in this analysis into how they make investment decisions and ensure that they're investing in companies that are really prepared to deal with these systemic risks. And not only prepared, but are going to actually prosper because they've already embedded safer and sustainable solutions into their outlook and what they're able to deliver to society.
Okay.
And if I could, add maybe one more point to that. I think there's another distinction that we need to establish, which is that we're asking companies and I guess investment firms and those within the financial sector to consider these material risks. There isn't a mandate necessarily to embed them within investment decisions and strategies. And certainly for large firms that have a multitude of clients, how they structure those investments will depend on the preferences of those clients. But I think what is of concern right now within the geopolitical context, specifically within the US, is the attempts to prohibit even considering the financial impacts of these very material risks. And I think Ali has summed it up very well, that creates significant financial potential costs, as well as just ongoing harm to people and planet, which then creates further harm to the economy.
As mentioned, BlackRock, the asset management titan, they withdraw from the Net Zero Asset Managers initiative. Some will say sustainability investments are like a Sisyphean task, rolling a black rock up on a hill for it to roll back down each time and again and again. Others might say that their green membership was mainly a nice marketing tool and qualify their membership as greenwashing. What are your thoughts on this?
So I think it's essential to get independent verification. I think ChemForward has got this great program right now in the cosmetic sector called Know Better, Do Better. And you have Ulta and Sephora and some of their suppliers all working towards metrics and verification that ensure that you're going into a positive direction that's aligned with what Ulta is asking their suppliers to deliver to. I look at sustainability as an essential part of innovation. And when you're not embedding it into innovation, I question whether or not it's worth the investment. In fact, I think it's going to have maybe very short-term limited returns, but it's not going to be the investment in my portfolio that I'm looking to for retirement or my children's college funds that deliver long and consistent returns. So I get very concerned when people separate it out, and I think Caroline's mentioned this, when people don't look at sustainability as essential to innovation and return on investment. Because I think all of the data and analytics we see is that it provides the critical return on investment that we all want to see.
Okay. Caroline, talking about greenwashing, what steps can companies take to ensure that their sustainability initiatives are transparent and credible to avoid accusations of greenwashing?
Well, I think you already said one of the key words, which is transparency. And so certainly in annual disclosures that we look at from companies, whether it's through annual financial disclosures or sustainability reporting, we want to see evidence of the impact and the outcomes of companies' sustainability commitments. It's one thing to have a beautiful, glossy policy statement and beautiful language around the commitment, whether it's to climate change or chemical management or human rights, but we really want to understand how companies are taking those policy commitments and putting them into practice, and what are the impact and outcomes for people and planet. So we strongly encourage companies to be as transparent as they can about the progress that they're making. And I think we always come into our engagements with portfolio companies from sort of a position of understanding and grace that for some of this stuff, it takes quite a bit of time. We're not expecting solutions instantly overnight or for everything to be magically changed and improved overnight, but we want to see that continuous journey and that there's a sense of progress. I think this is also, as an investment organization, where we rely on things like third-party benchmarking and third-party certification standards. So certainly from a chemical management perspective, we're looking to see, maybe as one example for companies in the consumer goods sector, do they have products that are certified against like EPA's Safer Choice or other third-party programs? Are they using things like ChemForward and the green screen screen for safer chemicals? And then those third-party benchmarks also help us understand if perhaps companies are greenwashing. So whether that's through ChemScore or focused on the retail sector, we have the Mind the Store retailer report card. There's things like the World Benchmarking Alliance. There's tremendous benchmarks out there that independently evaluate companies, their performance, their disclosure, and that helps us understand, again, that progress and that journey for companies, but also where there are gaps. And then we, as an investment organization and an active manager, can then focus on those gaps to really encourage companies to continue making progress.
Ellie, regulatory bodies also play a role in preventing greenwashing. The EU Taxonomy, for instance, helps prevent greenwashing by making it harder for companies to make false or exaggerated claims about their sustainability efforts. What recent developments have you seen in this area, both in the EU, the US, or maybe even globally?
This is a space where I think the EU is leading, both with the taxonomy, but the CSRD. I know that's been talked about a lot today, but revenue dependency metrics based on clear definitions is critical. And I think investors have asked for this often through frameworks like SASB, but companies haven't reported. So we don't have the sense of what companies' vulnerabilities are and or hopefully their value to like meet new green procurement guidelines. So I think CSRD is going to be a game changer. I think taxonomy is a game changer and other directives. Those are going to bring out data that we're going to use globally. And I think companies are inherently global. And we even see some companies in the US that don't sell in Europe, but they're adopting CSRD because they know investors are going to start to ask for it. So it's setting a really critical precedent that's going to bring better data to investors and customers. And I think from there, that will help, create the change we want to see.
Yes, some might even say that CSRD is the gold standard. But if it's the gold standard, Caroline, it seems the gold price is devaluating.
I think very similar comments to Allie's in the sense that from our perspective, we are very eager for CSRD and the potential that it can create for data that investors can utilize in our decision making, our engagement with companies. I think one potential benefit and opportunity I see from regulation like CSRD and the taxonomy is creating more of that level playing field. As I had mentioned earlier, we've unfortunately seen sometimes where companies are hesitant about stepping out into a leadership role and potentially being punished to some extent by the market and the market conditions. And so I think by having legislation that and disclosure requirements that apply more broadly across the economy in different sectors, that will help to create more consistent reporting, which is great, and a more level playing field so that those who are in a leadership position aren't necessarily being punished, if you will, by the market or other conditions for having a leadership position on various sustainability issues. And certainly for companies that are lagging and perhaps have been hiding behind that and cherry picking what they report against, whether it's to SASB or GRI or other reporting standards, they may not be able to do that anymore. And so where those shortcomings will now be apparent to the investment community and other stakeholders.
Okay. Caroline, you once said to me, it feels like talking to a brick wall since companies are not ready to invest or transform. What advice would you give those companies that are looking to start their journey towards sustainable growth and in need for investors like yourself?
I would say start small, start anywhere. I think in our engagement with various portfolio companies, especially on chemical management, it's very clear that this is a journey. And again, we want to see that continuous progress from them. So I would encourage companies, whether it's on safer chemicals, whether it's climate, other issues, is to, I think, sort of first and foremost, conduct ideally a double materiality assessment. So to understand the material risks to their own business, whether it's from climate change, biodiversity loss, the use of chemicals of concern, and then also what are those salient risks, that double materiality, where what are the impacts from their business and operations on people and planet. And once you have that assessment and that understanding, you can take that information, you can take that data to establish policy commitments and set priorities, but you have to start somewhere. And so I think initially you have to do that data collection process, you have to evaluate internally, you have to reflect, and then you can move forward from there. A couple other pieces of advice I would have is there are tremendous organizations out there, whether it's in civil society space, NGOs, investment community, other stakeholders who I think have really deep expertise on these different issues. Certainly as an investment organization, we have relied on folks like Clean Production Action and ChemSec and others to help inform us in our investment decisions around hazardous chemicals. Those same groups can be a resource to companies. So I encourage businesses to look for those types of partners, stakeholders who can provide them guidance, scientific data and expertise, and can also provide tools and resources to help them along that journey. Whether it's things like the Chemical Footprint Project or ChemSec's ChemScore, different benchmarking standards, all of those tools can help them get to where they want to go. But so my first advice is, I think don't be afraid, and you have to start somewhere and understand that it will be an ongoing journey, and you're not going to reach the end goal right away, but you have to start somewhere.
Okay, thank you very much. Ellie, some extra suggestions for the journey?
I think just building on what Caroline just said, I mean, it's about education, training. They don't have to they don't have to invent the process. So many leaders have already created good practice, best practice. Many of the companies we work with that are in that leadership realm that Caroline mentioned are willing to get on the phone and talk to other companies, help them take the first step. To me, the first step is the hardest, because it's a high-risk step and the culture isn't there within the company to understand the value. And that first step needs to be like a win for the company. So you want to take a small step, but also a step that they really see a viable solution. And I think that will really help create the momentum. And we work with companies at every stage of the journey, and we are seeing companies jump on board faster when they see their peers do it, when they see that they might be, at the low end of a benchmark that people care about, and hopefully that will all encourage more confidence to take this issue on.
Ellie and Caroline, thank you very much for sketching in 50 Shades of Green investment initiatives that can inspire investment in sustainable growth.